Good afternoon. Welcome to this session. I think we entitled it Post-General Election Roundtable. This is part of the Faculty of Social Sciences 50th anniversary, and it's one of PAIS's contributions to those events. I'm Chris Hughes. I've got the rare, sort of unique privilege of being both the chair of the politics department and chair of the Faculty of Social Sciences, so I'm working very hard to promote both events today, both this roundtable and the festival in general. The festival goes on for the rest of the week, so I would encourage you to dip in and out of various festival events. Every single department, centre, school, unit within social sciences is putting something on. So even if you're a member of PAIS, there are more things to come. There's a big IP conference tomorrow. But other departments, again, if you look at the programme, which is available on the website, you'll see there are plenty more events. If you're from another department, probably your own department is running something. So please partake in the festival. Okay, so as I explained, the purpose of today's roundtable is to do a bit of a kind of a debrief, I suppose, about the general election, but also to look ahead and to consider what are the implications for UK politics, UK political economy, and also the UK's role in the world after the election. When we originally, I think it was Wyn and I, when we originally thought up this idea of a roundtable, we weren't sure if we would actually have a government by this week. We were all expecting, I think, a coalition, probably some very complicated inter-party negotiations and so on. So we thought actually probably it would be a highly speculative session in terms of actually deciding, what would the government look like. But of course we do know what the government is, and I suppose in some ways we have some sense of what is coming down the track in terms of Conservative Party government policy and so on. But nevertheless, of course, we know that there are still many issues that the government is going to grapple with in terms of the economy and in terms of Britain's international relations. And what we have today is we have a range of speakers from PAIS who are going to speak to some of those issues, and they're going to talk briefly about particular areas of their speciality in terms of their research, but also I think they'll stray across into each other's areas of speciality, and the idea is to have a very kind of free-ranging discussion, and also to make this interactive and to have plenty of Q&A at the end. So I'll just briefly introduce my colleagues. So at the very end I have Matt Watson, Professor of Political Economy. Then we have Mike Smith, Professor of European Politics. Wyn Grant, again, Professor of Public Policy and Political Economy. Shirin Rai, Professor of International Political Economy, and Professor Richard Aldrich, Professor of International Security. You'll know many of them from PAIS, but also they're very notable figures in the discipline and across the faculty. So as I said, I think the plan is that I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to speak briefly. I think I said yesterday sort of 7 or 8 minutes or so. I'm not going to keep you so tightly to that time frame, but I think if you all speak for a few minutes, then by the time everybody's spoken, that will given us a very good foundation for a discussion, but also leave maybe around half the session for Q&A and so on and so forth. So I think that's more or less all I need to say by way of introduction. In terms of the running order, Wyn is going to be first up, and that means I need to hand across this microphone to Wyn.
No, I've got a microphone.
Oh, you've got a microphone,
yeah,
so
yeah.
Matt, I'm going to give you this in preparation.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I'm going to talk about economic policy, and Matt is also going to say something about that. And I'm going to say something about the election result itself, although I'm not really an elections expert. As far as the future course of economic policy is concerned, a lot really depends on events which are entirely outside the control of the UK government. For example, the possibility of Grexit, of Greek exit from the European Union, the consequences that would have for the Eurozone economies, whether there is any kind of renewed global financial crisis, and what the growth rates are going to be in the emerging economies which affect the world economy. As far as the UK specifically is concerned, I want to say something about fiscal policy. Now, of course, obviously, a lot depends there in terms of what happens to the economy over the next few years. If the economy does well, if GDP grows relatively quickly, and if employment does well, that will boost tax receipts and it will reduce payments on benefits and it will reduce the fiscal pressure on the government. However, I think one of the issues, of course, is that the government has painted itself into a corner because it's ruled out in the election campaign a whole range of tax increases in income tax, VAT and national insurance, which it's going to embody into legislation. So the options it has in terms of increasing taxes are relatively limited. There are some, for example, reducing tax relief on pensions, but they're relatively limited compared to the range of opportunities available. There are also, I think, a number of unfunded promises made in the campaign. I was quite surprised by the extent of these, given the government was trying to create an impression of fiscal rectitude. And the sources of expenditure cuts are actually unclear, I think, but Matt will probably is going to say more about that, where these cuts are actually going to come from, like the £12 billion cut in welfare. One underlying issue in the economy, an important issue that was hardly discussed in the campaign by any of the parties, is the issue of Britain's current very poor productivity record. Not the only country that's got a poor productivity record, the United States is also experiencing problems of this kind, but then other European economies are doing better than we are. Now, of course, that's important because if we get an improvement in productivity, it will make it possible to generate bigger increases in real wages, and it will make the economy more internationally competitive. Now, there isn't really a consensus view among economists about what the causes are of poor productivity. There are obviously multiple causes, but I think there are two major causes that most people would agree are at least of some importance. One is the issue that the UK has relatively low wages compared with its major competitors, and of course if you've got relatively cheap labour, then this tends to discourage investment in new capital, equipment, which would be used as a substitute for labour to some extent, and of course if you have new capital equipment, then on the whole, all other things being equal, this is likely to boost productivity. And I think a second problem is deficiencies in infrastructure in the United Kingdom, a whole range of deficiencies in infrastructure, particularly in the road system, for example, but also in the transport system more generally. So somehow or other, one would like to see a raft of policies that were designed to tackle that particular problem, but as I say, it hasn't been articulated very much in the election campaign, even as an issue, so it may be that we shan't see very much in the way of policy initiatives. Now, I want to say something about the election result, and as I said, I'm not really an elections expert. When the exit poll came out, and I was sitting in the RICO in Coventry with the BBC Coventry and Warwickshire team, I was surprised as anyone by the results of the exit poll, which of course turned out to be broadly correct, and were at odds with what the polls were saying throughout the campaign. I don't really want to go into the details of why the polls got it wrong, because they're going to conduct their own investigation into that. But I would make a few observations. Throughout the campaign, the Conservatives were ahead on two vital things. One was they were ahead on perceived competence in dealing with economic policy, and the other was they were ahead on leadership. I mean, Ed Miliband to some extent recovered, admittedly from a very narrow base, and narrowed the gap during the campaign to some extent, but certainly not to a sufficient extent. There was a very big gap in terms of perception by voters that David Cameron was seen as a much more prime ministerial figure, and that they had difficulty in visualising Ed Miliband in number 10 Downing Street. So those are two very strong cards for any party, because they're two of the most important determinants of how people vote, particularly those who are going to change their vote. Secondly, and I didn't really realise the extent to which this was going on, the Conservatives ruthlessly targeted Liberal Democrat seats where they had a chance of winning. I mean, they poured in resources of both persons and money, not just during the election campaign itself, but for a long time beforehand to get rid of those Liberal Democrats, although they gave Nick Clegg a relatively easy ride. Third factor, of course, is the rise of identity politics in Scotland. The Conservative emphasis on the SNP threat, the threat of a minority Labour government supported by the SNP, certainly struck home with voters during the campaign, and particularly, I think, with those voters who had defected to UKIP from the Conservatives, and some of those came back faced with this particular threat. Labour didn't do as well in recovering voters that had defected from Labour to UKIP, of which there was quite a lot, particularly in the north of England. And then Ed Miliband, of course, his analysis was that in the wake of the global financial crisis, the electorate had moved to the left, the median voter position had shifted. I mean, I don't think there was ever much concrete evidence of that in data at all. If the electorate had moved anywhere across Europe, it had moved to the populist right. Now, Ed Miliband thought there were few voters in the centre, and of course one of the characteristics of this election, I think, is there's relatively little shift of votes between Conservatives and Labour, which is not what one would normally see. But clearly there were voters, new Labour voters, people who voted for New Labour who were no longer voting for Labour under Ed Miliband. And you've only got to look at a seat like Warwick and Leamington, which was New Labour from 1997 to 2010, won by the Conservatives in 2010, won with a much bigger majority this time. So what I think Labour went for, and indeed the Conservatives went for it to some extent as well, was a core vote strategy, the belief that if you get the Labour core vote out, that would get you 35%. And that would be enough to get some kind of victory. And of course that turned out not to work. And I think they failed, Labour also failed, as a number of people accommodated, to put out a positive message about how people's aspirations could be fulfilled. They talked a lot about the cost of living crisis, but they didn't really tell people how things were going to get better, or at least not in a way that convinced people. So I'm going to stop at that point and hand over to Matt to talk more about the economy.
Thanks, Wyn. I think I can talk in a way that fits quite nicely onto the end of that. What I want to talk about is the direction of travel that's implied not only by the election result, but by the election campaign. The type of economy that we're likely to be living in over the next 5 years. The biggest impression that's doing the rounds at the moment is that not much is going to change. Certainly there's been a big emphasis from the Conservative Party that this has been a vote for more of the same. The issue there, to my mind, is whether we focus on the sameness or the more of it, because I think there are some important issues of trajectory that are going to make living in this economy rather different over the next 5 years to the previous 5. So let me just give you a few examples of the sorts of things that I'm talking about. Well, firstly, we've grown used to seeing a disproportionate burden of the tax system shifting towards the poorest people in the country. The Office for National Statistics has suggested that there's been quite a remarkable turnaround in the share of income of the lowest fifth that goes in tax, overall tax, compared to the share of income of the highest fifth of the population that goes in tax. Now, we get used to the idea of a progressive tax system that is likely to be graded upwards, so the richer you are, the more you end up paying in tax. The ONS figures therefore make for some interesting and really rather disturbing reading. At the point at which the election was called, the poorest fifth of the population were paying 1 percentage point more in tax overall than the richest fifth of the population. So 35 to 36% of their income was being spent in tax of one form or another. Given the way in which progressive taxation became one of the buzzwords of the election, given the way that the Conservatives were able to paint Labour as having a tax on the rich in mind, given the way that the Labour Party's internal recriminations have already started, and all the notions of aspiration that the Blairites are refinding now are suggesting that there is an unfortunate tendency of Labour leaders to try to punish the rich for their richness. Well, we live in a society now where the richest fifth pay less tax overall than the poorest fifth. And I presume that given the nature of the changes that are likely to come over the next 5 years, that's a tendency that's only going to be exaggerated. Another example comes in the cuts to public spending. So the idea that deficit spending is now wrong, it's the evil that has to be eradicated. We know that the Conservative government has already, with their coalition partners, made a start in this direction. But we're going to get more and more and more of the same of this. The Institute for Fiscal Studies believes that perhaps only 40%, or maybe even less than 40% of the cuts that would be necessary to get to budgetary balance have already been made. We don't know exactly where they're going to fall within the welfare budget, but we know that they're coming, and we know that they're coming big style. So we're going to have more of that. And of course, that's predicated on the idea that the old target of budgetary balance remains the one that the Conservatives want to aim for. But of course, in the weeks before the general election, the target moved. The target is now apparently a £25 billion annual surplus. So if you can imagine the cuts that have already taken place, then you probably have to multiply them by about 1.5 to imagine what's going to happen to get to budgetary balance. And then you're maybe going to have to multiply them by 1.5 again to get to what will happen to deliver a £25 billion surplus on the current account. We also know something very interesting about the way that the Department for Work and Pensions has been reorganised. It's become less of a policy machine and more of a megaphone for stigmatising the poor. One of the real changes that we've seen over the last 5 years is the discouragement that has been given to people to claim benefits that they're entitled to. We hear a lot in the news about benefit fraud. We hear very little about the entitlements to benefits that are simply not taken up. The ratio is about 13-1 at the moment. So 13 times more benefits that people are entitled to are not claimed than those benefits that are claimed fraudulently. That's certainly not the image that comes across from the newspapers, and we'll have to see how that goes in future. I can only suspect that that's going to get wider. The DWP has made claiming universal credit very, very difficult. The application form, I believe, now goes to 53 whole pages. Now, for those of us sitting up on this end of the room, we often feel overburdened by simple form-filling tasks in our everyday job, but I'm not sure we're faced often with a 53-page form. The DWP has also ensured that the only way that you can fill that form in is online, and yet a lot of the people who are in need of benefits don't have internet at home. Once upon a time, they'd probably have gone to libraries in order to access that internet connection. There aren't as many libraries around now as there used to be either. So the direction of travel here is very important. Another example, already we've had changes to the Controlled Foreign Companies Law, which has allowed companies much more scope to set up subsidiaries in tax havens so they can engage in aggressive tax planning, which of course means that they just end up paying less of that. If TTIP gets passed, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, this will just magnify all of those changes to the nth degree. This will allow corporations, the biggest corporations, to pretty much set their own tax rates, and tax for them will become voluntary in the way that it isn't for anyone else. So there are some very, very important things going on. Not much has changed in terms of the overall general tendency within economic policy, but the degree and the accentuation of those trends is likely to make an important difference. Given that, I think it was a very disappointing election in terms of the debate about economic policy. That debate never really got off the ground. There was a bit of mudslinging from both directions, but not a great deal of actual thought that goes into defining what an economy is and also what an economy needs from the state. It was simply about issues of competence and issues of leadership, as Wyn has already said. There were glimpses, of course, that things might have been different, but those glimpses quickly petered away. I thought it was actually really rather encouraging when Miliband said on the final question time in Leeds that he wasn't going to apologise for Labour overspending, but he would apologise for the fact that they'd introduced a system of banking regulation that clearly wasn't tough enough. I thought at last we might have a debate about the causes of the financial crisis. This was a debate that many people were asking for. It seems as though from all of the opinion polls that was a very popular position for him to have taken. We could have had a bit of banker bashing. Sign me up for a little bit of that in any case. But more generally, we could have had a debate about the way in which the economy had been regulated and the way in which the financial sector seems to be increasingly detached from the economy. But the next morning, the newspapers were reporting this as Miliband's first stumble of the campaign, and he backtracked almost immediately. He wouldn't push on those arguments, and he was back just to talking in platitudes about a better plan to do probably a little bit less of the same, but to do the same nonetheless. Another glimpse was when he came out against non-dom taxpayers, or non-dom non-taxpayers, as they should probably be called. This was very, very popular as demonstration effect more than anything else to suggest that there are arguments about fairness that could be made within and against the tax system. The idea that there are responsibilities that are shared by everyone within the tax system, not simply by those people who aren't able to avoid their fair shares. But once again, what was a very popular intervention within the debate quickly dissipated. This one seemed to fall foul of a big discussion about what Ed Balls might or might not have said 15 months previously about ending non-dom tax status. So all of those glimpses of something that might have made a difference, I think, quickly disappeared. And I think this was a spurned opportunity to have a proper debate about the type of economy that we want to live in, the type of society that we want to live in. Let me just end with three very brief observations about what that debate might entail. Firstly, I think there's still a need to have a debate about what it means to overspend. This was one of the words of the election. We couldn't go a day without discussions of overspending, whether that was overspending in the future, overspending in the present, or overspending in the past. Of course, there's no such thing as to overspend per se. There's simply a commitment to spend more than you're taking in tax revenue. But this works from both sides of the equation. To overspend is also to undertax. So Labour might have been guilty of profligacy during the new Labour period, but if it has culpability, that was mainly for not making sure that its increases in public spending were undergirded by increases in taxation. Secondly, I think this opens up a whole debate about the nature of spending commitments per se, especially those spending commitments that are future-oriented. I have to say, to borrow a phrase of Charlotte Church's, I'm as mad as hell every time the debate about the NHS comes simply down to money. That we know because of the factors of technology and of ageing, there is a 4% uplift in real terms that's needed simply to allow the NHS to continue in its current form. And that's locked into the very nature of what a national health service is. This now always gets reduced to discussions of unaffordability, fiscal drag, and suggestions about how to make the NHS cheaper. Just once, could we not have had the debate about what that means in real terms to people's lives? That 4% uplift means that the NHS is able to cure more people. It's able to keep more people alive for longer. It's able to give them a better quality of life during the time that they are alive. This to me looks like something to celebrate rather than to get bogged down in debates, bogus debates about unaffordability. And thirdly, lastly, another aspect of the debate that I was hoping would be had but wasn't is a debate about fiscal sociology, about what tax means within a society. Okay, so for 30 years there has been an ideological attack on the whole notion of taxation. So taxation is seen from one direction only. It's seen only in terms of what people give. So taxation becomes something that's taken away from you, taken away from your income. What about having a grown-up, mature debate about the other side of that equation, about what we all get from paying tax, about those things that help to make our lives fundamentally better on a day-to-day basis, that are themselves residues of the fact that a tax system is in place. So all of these things that could have been spoken about weren't, and because they weren't spoken about, even if the election result itself was a surprise, then I don't think that the direction of travel is. That seems to be locked in, and that makes me really rather glum.
Yeah, well, in fact, I can take up almost directly from that, except that I'm dealing with a bit of a paradox, which is that during the election campaign, nobody wanted to talk about Europe, really. After the election campaign, they've talked about nothing but in a lot of ways. And so I'm just going to say a few things about why I think that was the case, how I think the result indicates that the European issue might develop, and then what might happen in terms of the campaign or the debate or whatever that leads up to a referendum, which by people's current estimation will not be in 2017, it will be in 2016, and I can think of a few reasons for that, which I'll come to. I think the first thing to think about is some of the background. When people were asked about Europe as one of their priorities in terms of the election campaign, I think it was only about 17% actually said that Europe mattered or Europe was important to them. But of course, something like 70-odd% were saying that immigration was important to them, and in some way you've got there a proxy for Europe in terms of immigration from other member states of the European Union. So in some ways Europe wasn't entirely absent, and of course there were people in the campaign, UKIP in particular, who had Europe as the answer or the problem relating to almost everything. Now what does this reflect? Mark Leonard produced a European Council of Foreign Relations study just before the election campaign started, in which he argued that what we're talking about here is a population in the UK which is actually not that much different in terms of its views on the EU from other European countries, from a lot of other European countries, in which there has been an increase of right-wing populist opposition to the European Union, but in which most people treat the European Union a bit like the weather. They complain about it, but it's sort of just there. Now, we can come back to whether that is actually the case, but he produces a number of pieces of evidence to say that in terms of dissatisfaction with the EU, the UK is by no means the most dissatisfied population. It's Spain that has the least trust in the European Union, if you want to know. So we have this sort of population which is, grumbles about it, but it's not top of their list of priorities, except by proxy, maybe. We do have, though, a very strongly divided political elite in terms of the European Union. And of course, it's the political elite that have the capacity to communicate this, even if people aren't listening to them in quite the way they might hope. And it's the political elite that we're talking about when we come to the result of an election and how it translates into government. So it's not surprising, given that division among the political elite, that actually everybody in the campaign, apart from UKIP and maybe the Scottish Nationalists, Liberal Democrats to a degree, particularly Labour and Conservatives, wanted not to talk about Europe. David Cameron is notable among European commentators because he just has not ever said, and the government hasn't ever said, what it is they want to renegotiate with the European Union, although, there are lots of clues around. So, and you can see this as a negotiating tactic, you can see it as just a form of, just not wanting to raise the issue. The Labour Party certainly didn't want to talk about the European Union and the prospect of a referendum. because their position, of course, was no referendum unless there's a significant transfer of powers to the European Union. And one of the reasons for that, of course, was that the refusal to sign up to a referendum could be seen as a reason for deserting Labour and going across to people who did. And of course, we talked about the fact that in north of England in particular, lots of UKIP votes were taken from Labour. They weren't taken from Conservatives at all. So there were lots of reasons not to talk about it, and if you're looking at it from outside, European commentators in many cases were just bemused by the insularity of the election campaign and the fact that it didn't really talk about the European issue in any detail. You know, whereas in a number of other European countries this would be absolutely central, the future of the European Union and the place of the particular country within it. Now, what does the Conservative victory mean in this context? Well, perhaps now David Cameron will actually have to sell the European Union what it is that he wants to renegotiate and what it is that is on his agenda. But given that one of the main reasons for having the referendum pledge in the first place was outflanking UKIP and also, of course, outflanking the Eurosceptics within the Conservative Party, you can say that Cameron still has reasons for not coming clean on all of the agenda that he really wants to negotiate, or how he thinks he's going to negotiate it. One of the things in this brings us on to the prospects. Are we going to have a proper debate about the European Union? We've seen in other areas that, you know, there hasn't been real debate. We have maybe 18 months because I think the most obvious date for this is sometime in the second half of 2016. And the question is whether this will disrupt, and of course people have talked about this, normal party politics within the British context, whatever normal party politics are. And we want to know how this debate is going to be conducted, and somebody's going to have to actually say something about when and how this is going to take place. Will there be a proper negotiation? Well, one of the things that people in the European Union, the other 28 member states, in different ways and for different reasons, don't want is treaty change. They don't want people to open up the treaties of the European Union. So there will be all sorts of efforts to find ways procedurally or with, you know, opt-outs or with derogations for the British to actually achieve some of the objectives that the British say they want to achieve. The combination of a potential British exit and Greek exit from the Eurozone, is something that a number of people in Europe don't simply want to contemplate. But there are people in the European Union who are already arguing that there should be, partly because of Greece, partly because of Britain, a two-tier membership result from this. That in other words, the British would become kind of associate members, and some of the other countries who are outside the Eurozone would also become associate members, in which case you'd have to then try and work out what the difference is between Britain, Norway, Turkey, other countries that have associate status with the European Union. The role of the Labour Party is going to be absolutely crucial in this debate over and the negotiation. Because to the extent that the Labour Party actually supports on a cross-party basis what the Conservatives manage to negotiate, if they manage to negotiate it, that's going to have a huge bearing on the extent to which opposition within the Conservative Party takes a very prominent and central place in the whole debate and the whole process. Timing is of the essence here. One of the reasons for having this in late 2016 is because in 2017 there is A, a French presidential election, and B, a German election. Now there are always elections in the EU, but what you don't want is for those two particular ones to be also associated with the coming to a head of this negotiation with the British. So timing is also relevant in the fact that the rotating presidency of the European Union in late 2015 and early 2016 will be held by Luxembourg and the Netherlands. And those are two of the countries that you would choose to have in the rotating presidency, which is going to have a big role in the negotiations if you were the British. Clearly also within the European Union context, the role of the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, who happens to be Polish, of course, and has a particular angle on some of the issues we're talking about here, is going to be crucial. Finally, one final point. This is not all about the European Union, okay? One of the other manifesto commitments of the Conservatives, well, depends on how you read it, was either to water down very considerably the European Convention on Human Rights as it applies to the UK, or actually to repudiate it. Now that is an extraordinary situation, and it's one, personally, I hope never sees the light of day. But it's not just on moral grounds, it's on the fact that, for example, the whole devolution settlement in the UK is based on the incorporation and the embedding of the European Convention on Human Rights into the devolution settlements. And the Irish peace process the Northern Irish peace process is deeply, the Good Friday Agreement is deeply embedded into the European Convention on Human Rights. So quite apart from whether you think it's a good idea to repudiate one of your major humanitarian international commitments, there is the issue of how on earth you can do it, given the way it's woven into the fabric of the British constitutional settlement. Okay.
The military famously can't talk without PowerPoint. In fact, they can't fight now without PowerPoint. Sometimes battles had to be delayed in Afghanistan because the PowerPoint hadn't arrived. And in the spirit of that, a few slides. Forgive me. So defence was not particularly important during the election campaign. Traditionally, defence has never figured very largely in electoral campaigns, except perhaps during the Thatcher period. And certainly both main political parties were keen for this not to figure. Labour didn't want defence to come up because it raised the whole spectre of Iraq and Afghanistan. The Conservatives, Cameron in particular, were keen not to make major manifesto pledges on defence, so was also keen for defence to take a low profile. Actually, his main opposition during the election was his own right wing, who wanted to push him towards pledges on defence spending, which he did not want to make. The ticking time bomb in British defence policy is this thing, the nuclear deterrent. Nuclear deterrents are famously only useful if you do not use them. Nevertheless, the British nuclear deterrent will explode in around 2020, because it's at that point that the UK faces very major replacement costs in terms of the weapons and also the weapon vehicle. And that will make huge displacement within the British defence policy. Even during the Thatcher period, the estimated cost of Trident was between 20 and 25 billion. If you guesstimate it's about double that now, no one really knows. That makes a very serious inroad into your defence planning. And so at the moment there's a rush to try and get some things in before the replacement for Trident kind of squeezes that stuff out. The only two serious manifesto pledges that were made was to remain committed to the UK independent deterrent and to keep the army at 82,000. The right wing of the Conservative Party wanted to see a pledge to 2% of GDP. That was not made. Furious lobbying behind the scenes by the backbench, and look forward to some backbench rebellions on this. Just as there were sensitive issues 10 years ago that caused Labour backbench rebellions, people like Philip Cowley, who loves backbench rebellions, is going to be delighted by the new Parliament, because we go onto defence issues, we're going to see some backbench rebellions on this. One of the big issues here is the cost of cyber defence. No one in government understands cyber. There's John Norton's famous inverse law of the internet. The higher up you get in government, the judiciary, universities, the less people understand the internet, till you get to the top when the level of understanding is almost zero. People are going to be spending money on this. They don't really know what they're buying, and the charlatans in the defence supply companies are going to have a field day. But you can see that Cameron's objective, actually as he looks for savings, is to focus very strongly on defence. This is the trajectory over 2013, 14, 14, 15. Defence is something that is figured very strongly for squeezing by both Cameron and Osborne. There's going to be a battle with the right wing of the Conservative Party over this. Strategically, looking to the future, lots of hard choices. I think 10 years ago people were really saying we can shift defence spending from the old wars, NATO, Europe, expensive fighter jets, towards the new wars that were being fought in Afghanistan, in Iraq, cyber wars, but with gentlemen like this chap on the right here. You know, people, lots of defence commentators quite seriously contemplating the prospect of a medium-scale war in Central Europe on the borders of the former Soviet Union. So, you know, this is Putin's lovely new tank. He's ordered thousands of them. Where do you put your money? With a squeezed defence budget in which you're committed to replacing Trident, do you put your money on old wars? You buy tanks and fighter jets? Do you think about new wars? And bear in mind, Cameron wanted to intervene in Syria. So are you looking at a sort of insurgency, special forces capability, cyber wars? As I've already said, quite expensive. And the looming problem that if you don't spend on defence, the United States becomes a unilateral actor because nobody is technologically sophisticated enough to operate alongside them. Final slide, which I had to put up because this is Cameron's favourite. Cameron loves the spooks. He loves the spooks for two reasons. Firstly, because they've delivered for him in all kinds of foreign policy arenas, but also because with that 2% issue, what Cameron wants to do is roll in spending on intelligence, security, counter-terrorism into the defence budget and then claim he's spending 2% when in real terms he actually isn't. This is another looming crisis for the new government, because at some point the government will have to confront the issue of privacy, data, communications interception, the Snowden issue, if you like. And again, on the right wing of the Conservative Party, there are people like David Davis who are going to make quite a lot of fuss about this. I think that's me done.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. Shirin.
Yes, well, I don't know what I'm doing here because I don't work on the UK at all, as many of you know. So let me start at the very beginning. I came to this country in '85, and within 6 months of being here, I had a ballot to vote in the British elections, and I was absolutely flabbergasted. We don't allow foreigners to vote in Indian elections so easily. So the question then was, what am I doing voting in British elections while, this was I think the local elections, while my best friend by then was an American and she had to go every month to get register with the police station. So of course there the question about post-coloniality becomes really clear because I came from India. I mean, I had an Indian passport at that time, and of course Commonwealth citizens are allowed to vote in this election. So then it makes me think all this concern about who is British and who is not becomes really puzzling for me. So that was my first elections that I looked at. My work, as you know, is on international development and on gender and politics. Both of those, like what Richard said, didn't really make it onto the agenda of the elections this year. international development seems to be quite a strange thing for me, because it seems like all the big parties have a consensus now that the 0.7% of the GDP figure is not to be touched. It's to be sort of, you know, the Greens want 1%, the UKIP wants to abolish it altogether, but other than those two left-right extremes, and they want to abolish DFID as well, so there'll be a lot of bureaucratic saving that Cameron wants to make. But other than that, there seems to be a relative sort of consensus around this. And yet, if you look at UK politics, you realize that actually international development, you might have heard yesterday about the demotion of, what's his name, Shapps? What's his first name? So he's been demoted by becoming a Minister of International Development, right? And I remember, I think it was, what was it, in 2012, when Justine Greening was demoted by being made the Secretary of State for International Development because she had been Secretary of State for Transport. So international development, on the one hand, shows a great deal of consensus amongst political parties across the board. Yes, we need it. And yet, at the same time, it is not valued, obviously, in terms of the politics of people who are engaged in it. UK spending on aid is, I think, around 11.3 billion, while defense, I think, is 40. Right? So the difference between 0.7 and 2, I don't know what the rate is just now in terms of defense. There is a big gap, and yet the two are sort of slightly connected as well. So where, again, to go back to the European question and the biggest crisis just now in terms of migration, I was really puzzled and bemused when the discussion went straight away from, should we be rescuing these people, and should we go and bomb these agents who are sending, you know, their vehicles, their boats. And I was thinking, is that what you can think of, sort of going and immediately bombing? Haven't you done enough bombing in that part of the world and created enough problems for yourself? But it did make me think about the way in which the talk about development very often rubs against talk about security. And I think that is one of the reasons why there is a consensus. So as far as I can tell, there are two reasons why there is a consensus. One is the colonial, post-colonial hangover, which is Britain's place in the world, right? It is still a giving country. It is still a country which is rich. It still can influence policy out there through aid restructuring. And I think the second one, of course, which is, I'm surprised, and that is why I was so surprised about this kind of reaction, let's go and bomb these boats, is that in the 70s and 80s, we used to have a lot of debate about what works better in terms of security. Does developing third world, as they used to be called, states, does investing in those states, creating jobs, is that the best way of sort of securitizing, the word wasn't used then, our own borders, right? Or is it sort of, you know, going down the route that we have? And I think that that debate has kind of gotten lost. Again, it's one of those sort of missed opportunities that Matt was talking about so many of. And I just wonder why that is. And one reason why I know poor Peter Kellner is going to be in the deep freeze as far as Cameron is concerned, because he might not have made some of these uncosted promises when if the sort of, you know, polling had been okay. But he was saying how they surveyed a sort of, you know, a lot of people about international aid in the context of cuts that are needing to be made. And surprise, surprise, when they sort of put in, they had about 6 options. At the top, 68% of people said it should be international development budgets that should be cut, because it's about people out there. And yet, then I think of Red Nose Day and what are these, all these big things. People give, you know, Nepal, unfortunately, again, has had an earthquake today. People give really generously, right? So there's this sense of somehow what the state does and what individuals do in terms of international development or international charity is different. But he also, and the second one, by the way, was welfare cuts. Go for the welfare regime. And therefore, of course, it's an easy target. It becomes an easy target. And the second thing that he said, of course, was, but if you don't give them a list which includes international development, say, what is it that actually bothers you in terms of, your own future? International development hardly ever is picked. So it's a peculiar little sort of conundrum for us as social scientists as to how do we think about these issues and the way in which they have come up in this election. I think the welfare cuts are particularly important for the second area that I'm interested in, which is gender and politics. So all the cuts that Matt was talking about and Wyn were talking about, these are not gender neutral cuts, right? So the DWP, the quiet man, quiet cuts are really very much focused on the state on the one hand and on the poorest, as Matt has already said, on the other. So if you're thinking about the kind of regimes that have been put in place, those are cuts to public sector services, which is where women's employment is concentrated very often. Secondly, in terms of restructuring the everyday lives of the poor, you've got things like the Troubled Family Program, where you try and restructure way in which we think about the family as opposed to the household. And there again, women are in the front line of these cuts and in these restructuring. We also have, some of my colleagues in the politics department are quite concerned, and quite rightly, for social science research in terms of the missing data, right? You think about working on international development and you think like, do we even have proper data from Africa about X, Y, and Z? But actually there's a big missing data problem in this country too. We've got, for example, data on welfare cuts and its impact on women, largely thanks to organizations like Fawcett or the Women's Budget Group. But we don't have the data disaggregated data as to how ethnic minorities, black people as opposed to white people, are actually sort of being affected by these cuts. So there are these missing gaps that have emerged as well. In terms of politics, I think that we've got a better story this time round. So in terms of people who have got elected, which is what this panel in some ways is about, we have got 29.5% that are women. Now that does still mean that 70% of people walking into Westminster are men, right? As opposed to, I think it was 22% women last election, right? Now, you could just say, why does that matter? And of course, now the poster girl of all this is Marie Black, right? This 20-year-old Glaswegian who has beaten Danny Alexander. So why does this matter? It matters because performance of politics matters. If you think back, and some of you weren't here probably, but there was this whole business about Cleggmania, right? Through the debates between leaders, he just emerged as this really sincere, absolutely beautiful performer, which is why, of course, Cameron didn't want the debates in the same format again. So performance matter, performance of people who are out there actually performing politics and who those bodies are and who's speaking in whose name matters. But I think it matters much more in terms of the institutional performance, right? Performance in the sense of what do institutions do to encourage more women to be part of our political establishment. Does that mean that Tory women will start saying, oh no, we shouldn't have cuts? No, of course not. Their politics matters as well the party politics matters as well. But I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, and where I see some improvement, is that if we have more people, so Chaka Amuna, for example, now being seen as perhaps a future leader of the Labour Party, though I read an awful piece in the Huffington Post in which they quoted some Tory agents saying at the election time that Miliband didn't win because he was a Jew, and we don't trust Jews. So there's a lot of racism to overcome, et cetera, but the fact that we are there, it makes a difference, because you see more people of different, from different backgrounds in public political life. So let's hope that that continues, but I still think that there is an argument to be had in terms of where our spending lies, in terms of why is it that we don't think of defense as an area where we can have a trade-off in terms of welfare. I don't know. So from what Richard is saying, you know, that it seems that there is going to be a big debate between the Tories, among the Tories, about defense spending as well. So finally, I think all I want to say is hopeful. What am I hopeful for? Maybe think about not just the fact that there is a clear majority of Tories in government now, and with all the worries that both Matt and Mike in particular have pointed to, but I also think of 1992. What has been the extent of the victory, and that it is quite a small victory. Despite the 5-year fixed term, we might still have some fun and games in terms of rebellions to make Philip Cowley happy or to make me happy. And there will be debates that we can intervene in as academics and as young people who are part of our politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much to my colleagues. Sense is we should just jump straight in, and we'll take questions from the floor. Just please put your hand up, and then maybe try and keep your questions relatively short, and we'll have relatively quick answers. And maybe identify yourself as well. So I've got Michiel first. So.
Yeah, thanks. So Michiel, PhD student here. I have a quick question for Matt. Thanks very much all for the very interesting talks. You mentioned the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, and then the role of grand corporations who can then pick and choose where they invest and based on the tax rate and so on. Would you have any thoughts on how that would affect a choice for the referendum about the EU? How would that affect your choice yourself, whether you would like to stay or not in the EU, given that race to the bottom you mentioned or referred to from grand corporations? Question mark.
Matt, do you want to go?
I think it maybe just shows how stuck we are in terms of the broader debates about what sort of society we want to live in, what sort of economy we want to have and to be involved in. When you put the question like that, you can have lots of people who will think that there isn't an answer. There isn't necessarily a good position to be in. I think that when it comes to the likely referendum, there'll be lots of people voting to stay within the European Union despite TTIP. There won't be anybody voting to stay in the European Union because they're delighted about TTIP, and that's the thing that really grabs their attention. So the narrowness of the terrain over which all of these big political issues are played out means that there are some highly qualified choices that are out there for people.
Can I just say a word about it? Yeah, one of the things I work on is EU-US relations, and Matt's right that it's not going to be a conclusive thing when it comes to the EU referendum, but there will be people lining up on either side. I mean, the Greens against TTIP for various reasons. And obviously one of the issues about the possible Brexit is that the British government, and not to say others in the British Parliament, seem to operate on the assumption that they could negotiate something like it. The major political parties were all in favour of TTIP in this election. My personal judgment is that TTIP will not get agreed, certainly not before any EU referendum. Think of what you've got coming up in the US over the next 2 years, the difficulties that the Trans-Pacific Partnership has had in the US, although there seems to have been some shift in that. So my view is actually it's not going to get agreed. But there are other people who say, well, initially they thought it would be done, so one person said, on 1 tank of gas. You do it in 2 years. Well, no. Anybody looking at it could know that that wouldn't be happening. And it will become more politicised. It has become more politicised. It's not going to be the crucial factor in any EU referendum, but it will be a factor in any contemplation of a British exit from the EU, about how you negotiate parallel agreements. And of course, it's one of the big arguments about British exit that if you do exit, you lose the collective clout of the European Union in negotiations like that.
I would like to ask the members of the panel a quick question about the S word. I'm not talking about social or sciences, I'm talking about Scotland. What if, my home constituency actually, Coatbridge, Cryston and Belsill, the last election before this one, 20,000 Labour majority, before that 17,000. I think the safest seat in the country twice. I could never have foresaw a 33.6% swing to the SNP, so I think that there's a real seismic shift in Scottish politics, and I'd like to sort of ask the panel to reflect on what implications that would have upon British politics, and then B, their analysis. So thinking of Richard in terms of obviously the Trident up in Faslane, I think that this is quite interesting. For Shirin, the SNP have got some very interesting gender policies. For Wyn, in terms of what if Scotland was to go independent, what effect would this have on progressive politics in England? Would it just mean it would be a complete conservative lockdown in perpetuity, or would it rejuvenate and revitalise the left in England? For Mike, what effect would it have on the European referendum, and on that, in terms of the political economy of these islands, what effect would sort of Scottish independence have on that? So that's the question. And the second question, a little bit of a cheeky one. So a Scottish university comes in, offers you a 30% pay increase to go and be a distinguished professor there. Sorry, Chris. You find yourself, the referendum on Scottish independence comes up. I'd like to put you on the spot and be a little bit cheeky. Would you vote? How would you vote?
Okay, well, I mean, clearly the Scottish nationalists have done extraordinarily well, and this does pose, of course, a lot of big challenges for the Conservative government. Clearly what the Scottish nationalists were hoping was that they would have a minority Labour government, which they would then push in the kind of direction they wanted in terms of increasing public spending and so on. That's now not going to happen, so their influence on Westminster policy will not be as great as they anticipated that it might have been. But the difficult issues, of course, are what one does about further devolution, how far one goes beyond what is already in the table in terms of what came out of the Smith Commission and so on, in terms of further devolution. It may well be, I think, that the government will offer more to Scotland than it's offered up to now, in an attempt to dampen down this enthusiasm. But I think the problem is because we've been going through a devolution process for a long time now, and of course the more you offer, it still leaves the Scottish nationalists reasonably enough from their perspective unsatisfied. Anything short of independence is going to be unsatisfactory from their point of view. But I think the government will try and offer a bit more in order to, and of course the Scottish Nationalist MPs, I think, face the problem of having raised expectations to a very high level about the impact they can have, then in fact they may not have anywhere near the impact that they hoped they would have given the political circumstances. Okay, who's next? We'll talk about the
I can say a bit, yeah. Sorry, Richard, go on. The link to the referendum is the obvious thing. Obviously, if I'm anywhere near right and the referendum takes place sometime in 2016, There's Scottish election, Holyrood election in May 2016. I would be quite surprised if there wasn't some sort of commitment in the SNP manifesto for those elections on a further referendum, because everything that Nicola Sturgeon has said and other people have said has left that option open. But clearly there's a very strong link between those elections and the EU referendum. In terms of the EU referendum, my broad feeling is that the closer you get to a referendum, the more, and this is a big qualification, the more people know about it, because they don't necessarily won't necessarily be presented with all the facts. Then there'll be a majority in favour of staying in the EU. It's very noticeable in English politics that the more UKIP became salient in the last couple of years, the more the opinion polls showed a majority in favour of staying in the EU. So I think that effect might well carry on. Now, if you say, well, okay, that sort of diffuses at least part of the SNP thing, there are all sorts of other things that could revitalise the SNP thing. I don't happen to think that all those people that voted for the SNP were necessarily voting for independence. If you very, very crude arithmetic, 45% of people in Scotland voted yes in the referendum. 50% voted yes, or voted for the SNP in the elections. And in a way, it is very crude. You could say, well, those are all the people that voted yes in the referendum, or the proportion of them for the turnout, plus a number of others who were just, completely fed up with Labour, basically, because Labour had become decrepit, complacent, and badly organised and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think that this was a vote in favour of independence, but I'm absolutely sure that over the next couple of years, if things go badly, both at Westminster and in the line of the badly from one perspective at least in terms of the EU referendum, then the independence vote will become much more solid and much more difficult to deal with. I had other points, but I'll hand on to whoever wants to take it next. Richard.
Yes, I mean, clearly on defence, this resonates because there are very different positions on things like the independent deterrent. Britain has stored most of the nasty stuff up in Scotland. The SNP don't like that, understandably. I think the point that Mike made is very interesting. We've had these massive swings, unimaginable swings to SNP, and yet the poll data on the specific issue of independence suggests that sentiment hasn't moved very much on that. And I think to some extent you've got this strange inverse effect where, if you have, the more devolution you have, the less national elections matter perhaps in Scotland, and people feel perhaps a little bit more free to express sentiment, a little less concerned about the economic consequences. And you've almost got the same, not quite the same thing, but almost the same effect. Why did UKIP do so well in the European elections not that long ago? Because people just thought, get a bit of a laugh. I can just, up yours to laws kind of thing, but it doesn't really matter. European MPs, who cares? A little bit of that, I think, in the recent national elections, because of course Scotland has its own parliament and is dealing with a lot of its own affairs. I think there's going to be a lot of thought on this. I mean, there've been suggestions about federal solutions. I certainly think you will see political parties rebranding themselves. So the idea of a Scottish Labour Party, a Scottish Conservative Party, identity politics is clearly big. People are learning about this. Expect to see some kind of Warwick style messing around with the logos, perhaps.
Moving swiftly on.
Yes, exactly. Very swiftly. I think there are two words which come to mind, and again, sort of, from my position, looking not inward but outward. One is nationalism, obviously, and the other is populism. And I just think that that sense of maybe it is that it's a Labour's problem for not having, or whatever I'm reading in the press, taking the Scots for granted and taking Scottish votes for granted. But I think that there is a sense in which there is also some sort of a shift that's taking place through that nationalistic politics in terms of populistic divisions that are being sort of now drawn, which is England is conservative and we are progressive politics. And I just think that if you look at the history of recent history of SNP voting with the Tories against Labour as well, it's a more complex history, but populist anti-austerity rhetoric seems to resonate, and resonate quite interestingly, not resonate, but intersect interestingly with nationalism. So on the one hand, yes, of course, people voted to remain in the UK, but once we are in the UK, we still are different. And SNP has been able to speak in that voice. I suppose from my perspective, also in terms of gender and politics, SNP has not done that brilliantly. It's only 25, so 75% of its MPs are men, as opposed to the Labour Party, where you've got 42% of Labour MPs are women. So it's not as if that they have done so brilliantly. But their anti-austerity rhetoric definitely resonates more with women because, of course, as I said earlier, sort of, the welfare cuts are being particularly severely seen in terms of women's everyday lives. So I'm just curious to see how this works out. Now, there's been a lot of talk also about sort of, how SNP's huge majority means that, or UKIP's complete sort of, just the same one seat, not the same, but one seat. Does that mean we should have PR or we should open up that whole box again, etc.? And then I look at India, we've got, thanks to you lot here, we've got first past the post Westminster system, and yet we've got 27 political parties, most of them regional, not all of them national. But there is a different accommodation which sort of accrues when you think about politics differently and regionally. So maybe that's where we are heading. But I just feel like sort of, Little England needs to look outward to see other experiences of the same.
Andy, I'm not sure that I needed the experience of last week's election to confirm my belief that I think that the Union is now a dead duck, the Union of the United Kingdom. I can't see how it will survive into the medium term. But I think this week's election really did go further in cementing that view within my mind. I think there's a different style of politics that grew up around the referendum campaign in Scotland, a different way of trying to reach people, a different way of talking to people, of devising languages that meant something to people that they could recognise in the way that they were trying to live their own lives. I think we've got a political culture via Westminster that becomes increasingly detached from that. I think all five of us were either saying outright or hinting very strongly that it was a disappointing election, the general election politically, that there seemed to be so much that could have been debated that wasn't, so much that could have been spoken about that wasn't, so much of the electorate that could have been engaged on one issue or another, but it looked as though the politicians ran away from the electorate rather than trying to embrace them. So I think what the Scottish referendum campaign did and did very effectively for those who were seeking a yes vote was that it allowed them to develop a new style of politics that goes back into these spaces where what the SNP now call the Westminster parties had vacated. And I think that is a real dividing line in the style of politics that's undertaken within the United Kingdom now. It might not necessarily show up in the most recent opinion polls, but I think it's hugely important nonetheless. I go back to the Scottish referendum campaign night. I actually wasn't entirely sure. In fact, I didn't know at all just how much I wanted the people in Scotland to vote yes until they didn't. And when they didn't, it struck home to me the enormity of what this now meant in terms of the political agenda for Britain as a whole. Who was the first person on College Green outside Westminster to be interviewed once the confirmation came through that the No campaign had won, Nigel Farage talking about a Scottish tail wagging an English dog and this must stop. What was the first thing that Cameron did on Downing Street that morning? He went out and promised that a process would be put in place to deliver English votes for English laws. Of course, this is constitutional nonsense. Under the Bonnet formula, there is no such thing as an English law and an English law only, because every vote that's taken on how to spend money in England has ramifications in both Scotland and Wales, precisely because of the lock-in with the Bonnet formula. So there isn't a space to develop a policy of English votes for English laws, even though they're pushing ahead to try to find one that will work to their advantage as much as possible. So I think that what we have here is some completely unforeseen consequences of the Scottish referendum campaign. I think it tells me that Cameron was a hugely lucky Prime Minister as well. Can you imagine a Conservative Prime Minister losing the Union? He wouldn't have been Prime Minister for much longer, would he? He allowed other people to go and defend his job, and those other people seem to have borne the brunt of the electoral politics of Scotland this time around. At the same time, he then comes out, thinks that he has a mandate to talk in soft English nationalist tones, whereas for the majority of us in England who are feeling disillusioned with our politics, it's the distance that we feel from the political centre, from the political elite, from the Westminster system. That's not going to change at all with English votes for English laws. So I think a momentum is already in place, and that momentum is going to have profound consequences for the Union.
Okay, time's running a bit low, but I've got two more questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both those questions together and then ask the panel to respond, and that will probably use up my time, I'm afraid. So there's a question here and a question there. So do you want to go first, please?
It seems to me that one thing hasn't been wasn't talked about much on TV and the newspapers is involvement, voter turnout, etc. It's not just turnout. It's this is the big contrast for me between what happened in Scotland and what happens in England and Wales. The enthusiasm, I think, high voter turnouts in Scotland. And the question really is, as educators, I mean, what do you think about political literacy in England and Wales? I feel it's just from what you've been saying, there's this great gap in terms of the things you've been talking about, the debates you feel have not been addressed, and particularly international, it seems to be dimensions of the situation that we're in, which have not been talked about. People are not interested, or people didn't, when they turned up, they didn't know who they were going to vote for until that very moment. It reflects a kind of lack of political literacy in this country, it seems to me. And what to do about it if you think that's the case.
My question is on the defence. You spoke about new wars, old wars, and cyber wars, but I would like to know, where do you think the focus should be on and why?
So do you want to, does everyone want to have a go at the first question, and then maybe we get the last question?
I think Matt's answered from my point of view.
Okay, so maybe...
I've got more to say.
Okay. So let's go.
You always have more to say.
So on the first question, let's go Shirin, Wyn, Mike, and then to Richard. Then Richard, you maybe want to answer on the defence question specifically. Okay, give you time to think about it.
Okay, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I was looking into this in the run-up to the election itself. And as a department, we tried to do something about it. Shahnaz is here. And we wanted to access schools in Coventry to say to people, sort of, PSA tried to do something about it last year when I chaired a session in the House of Parliament, basically for schools, where all three political parties sent representatives, including Diane Abbott, to say basically, we don't care where you vote. Of course we do, but we'd rather you voted for us, but please vote anyway. And of course, part of that is, the problem there is that young people seem to vote. How many here didn't vote who could have voted? Much less than older people, we know that. But even within the younger people, I think it was, for the last election, it was about 44% of young men voted, those who could have voted. And for women, the figure was 39%, right? So that is an appallingly small sort of, percentage of young people voting. And I definitely think you've put your finger on the right sort of thing, which is we need our young people more engaged in politics. But how do you do that? Right? And how do you do that in a context in which politics itself is being reconfigured, where young people don't necessarily think just about political parties, but also think about politics in a much bigger way. And so as educators, yes, we can have conversations in classrooms, but then we can't be partisan. But we can have conversations in classrooms, and we do, I think, some of us. If you think about even sort of, education, and that's the one thing that we haven't talked about is student fees, right? Should we have fees? Should we, what is the status of education as a public good? What is the nature of society? That those big questions that we do need to engage with as early as we can. Now, I don't know the sort of syllabus that sort of A-levels are taught in terms of civics or whatever, but I definitely think that as a university, our widening participation strategy, our communication with young people needs to address that problem of that gap, which is just too wide. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay. Well, I mean, the turn-up was up marginally in England and Wales. There were some very big turnouts in Scotland, which were a reflection, I think, of the debate that started with the referendum campaigns. During the period in the run-up to the election, I did go to a number of schools in different parts of the country where they were having mock elections, which was certainly stimulating quite a lot of interest among pupils in the general election and in the issues that arose. But, I mean, it has to be recognised there are a lot of people in the country who are not very interested in politics at all. I mean, most of the members of my family are not at all interested in politics. They don't see it as very relevant to their lives, and I think that's a very common view that people hold. And how you change that, and I guess you start with young people maybe, but I mean, I don't think it's a very easy thing to change that kind of perception.
Yeah. There's one very specific thing that interests me, which is, of course, that support for membership of the European Union is inverse to age, right? The younger you are, the more you support membership of the European Union on the whole. The older you are, the more you are likely to be a UKIP member, and the more you're likely to oppose it. And actually, of course, there have been some proposals for lowering the voting age in the European Union referendum, and I think, I have mixed views on that. I think on the Scottish precedent, actually, I think it would be a very good thing to do, because it would contribute to some sort of dealing with the issue you're identifying. But on the other hand, of course, an EU referendum, one of the things about either studying or knowing about the EU is that there's an awful lot to know about, and it's awfully turgid, quite a lot of it. So it might not be the best occasion on which to do this. On the whole, though, I think that I'd be in favour of that, and that it's predominantly, revealing my colours. It would be because it would maximise the chances of Britain staying in the EU. But another thing that is going to happen, now that they've got a majority, the Conservatives, is, of course, there are going to be boundary changes in, is it the whole of the UK or is it England and Wales? The whole of the UK. Oh, yeah. And that is going to have another set of influences, because everybody agrees in old party politics terms that would disfavour the Labour Party. But of course, we're not dealing with the old party politics necessarily anymore. So the effects of that might be very difficult to predict.
Just a quick word, Matt.
I'll pretend I didn't hear that. I think we've reached a really curious point in the evolution of our political system, in which party politics is giving politics a bad name. So I think there is a clear distinction here between disillusionment in party politics in Britain and disillusion with politics in general. I think there are lots and lots and lots of young people who think in ways that we as educators would tell them is deeply political, but because they feel cut off from party politics, would not use that description themselves. So I think there's a desire to be engaged, there's a desire to engage, but the capacity to be involved, certainly if that's rooted through the party political system, I think this is a big turn-off for lots of people, including and probably primarily young people. With some of my colleagues who aren't here at the moment, I've been involved in some community education programs, going out, trying to engage people, to talk to them about the economy in the wake of the financial crisis. These are often people who live quite vulnerable lives, but boy, are they political when you give them the chance to be political. I think they just want the chance more than anything else, and unfortunately party politics in this country at the moment doesn't give them that chance.
Yes. So finally, Richard, do you want to? You can have a comment on this one. But
No,
the defence one's
I
for
think
you,
I think the question about political education has been answered.
Okay.
The defence one is a conundrum, but I think nevertheless there are discernible choices. In terms of old wars, well, I wouldn't be worried about that, because if it was a small-scale conflagration on the boundaries of Russia, well, you know, do British soldiers want to fight for the security of Moldova? You know, I'm not quite sure where it is. I'm not sure there's that degree of engagement. And if it was a major eruption of, well, I think it then becomes a bilateral issue. You know, so I think it's a level of conflict which is beyond us. I think in terms of cyber, if I was under a cyber attack, who would I ring? Not GCHQ, I'd probably ring BT or Microsoft. I think there what we're looking for actually is arms control in cyberspace. Global governance is the level at which to address some of these cyber issues. So I think we're left with actually the area in which Britain has seen most engagement historically since 1945, which is small wars, peacekeeping, whether it's what I think was a fairly valuable contribution in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, or I think something which has been frankly negative equity in Iraq or Afghanistan. Those are the sorts of things. New wars, perhaps some old new wars, is where we're going to be engaged over the next 10, 20 years. That's probably where I'd put my money.
I just say,
Yeah, Mike.
just as an intriguing juxtaposition, that it's Britain in the Security Council of the UN that has drafted the resolution that represents the EU's effort to get a mandate to use force against Libyan people traffickers in Libya. And in line with what Richard was saying about new wars and so on, the resolution, at least the draft of it, said that the aim of the use of force is to disrupt the business model of the people traffickers. 21st century.
So I'm afraid we are running out of time, so I'm going to have to draw it to a close. I think it's been a fabulous session. I think we've seen insights from across the board, all aspects of UK politics, the economy, diplomacy, security, international relations. It's just a little glimpse, I think, of the sort of some of the wisdom and expertise we have in PAIS. There's some great questions, lots of engagement. I think it's been a brilliant session. I'm sorry that we have to draw it to a close. We could probably go on even longer, but I think, you know, I'd just like you to join me in thanking our speakers for putting on such a brilliant session. And thank you very much.